And I think we're as close to a quorum as we're going to ever get. So, Janae, you want to call a roll?
For the April 4th meeting of the Charter Review Commission, Judge Adrian.
Here.
Diane Downing.
Here.
Here. Kennedy. I don't think he's here. Michael King.
Here.
Mayor Persiak.
Here.
Claire Rizzaco.
Here.
Victor Ruiz.
Here.
And Davita Russell, who wasn't here. So we have a quorum.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, Judge.
So we're back on task after a really good and I think clarifying discussion 2 days ago on the issue of succession. We're now going to go back to the regular schedule that we had, although we did not finish the discussion that we had begun with regard to succession for both council and the exec. And we'll revisit that. We'll pick a date at the end of today's session when we can come back and finally put a period behind that one. We have campaign finance as a member of, I should say, as the primary order of business. Before we do that, though, I need to know if everybody's had an opportunity to review the minutes from not the last meeting, but the last meeting before that. And if so, they were distributed. And if you have had an opportunity to review them, then I'll entertain a motion to accept the minutes from March the 14th.
I'll move to approve.
Second.
Properly moved and seconded. Is there any unreadiness on the motion? Any unreadiness on the motion? Any readiness on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Comment which I should have made is that I was at this meeting,
Oh,
and I don't think my name appears.
we'll accept that as a friendly amendment to the motion then.
Yeah.
And the record will so reflect. Okay. That being the case, is there anyone opposed? Hearing no opposition, minutes will be accepted as distributed. As I said, today's discussion will be around the issue of campaign finance, and Mr. William Tarter Jr. has presented us with information. That information has also been distributed prior to today's date for the Commission's review and consideration. He's here to elucidate on the matters that he distributed and to give us some additional thoughts about the possibility of adopting this. So, Mr. Tarter, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission and County Executive and County Council folks who are here, as well as the guests. I'd like to first thank the Commission for allowing me the opportunity to present today on a very important subject. I know that you guys have a lot on your plate, and I appreciate you guys being open to my presentation today. As you can see, I'm here as an individual, as a taxpayer. I was a member of the 2012 Charter Review Commission, and I'm very proud of the work that we did and the things we were able to accomplish. And I'm looking forward to the work that this commission is doing, building off of a lot of things that we learned back in that 2012 experience. I should also mention that I'm not representing my employer. I work at Center for Community Solutions, not representing any other civic organization either. I'm here as an individual and as a taxpayer and someone who's just really interested in ensuring that we can build trust and continue to build trust in our government. So I want to say thank you to everyone that I have been able to work with to put together this presentation. What you see in your packet as well as in your PowerPoint is the result of a lot of research and a lot of study and a lot of interviews with current and past public officials, advocates, national experts, in trying to wrap our heads around a very complex and multifaceted issue. And it's my goal today to be able to provide a little bit of a glimpse into how we got to this point and then hopefully we can take some steps on how to move forward collectively. I will add that I'm thankful to have the organizational support of the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, as well as the Cleveland chapter of the NAACP. I'm thankful to also have the support of some of the individuals who you'll be hearing about later on in the presentation. Catherine Terser, who is the head of Common Cause Ohio, as well as the former chair of the 2012 Charter Review Commission, Mayor Bruce Akers. So to have bipartisan support is also tremendous as well. And then I just recently, like a couple hours ago, got a statement, an actual quote from my state senator, Matt Dolan, who you will also be hearing about in this presentation. And his quote is, "Campaign finance limits and transparency are an essential part of an open and fair county government." So I appreciate his statement and his perspective as well. All right, so let's get to it. The overall thesis of this presentation is an actual quote that comes from the city of Philadelphia. And the city's campaign finance laws sets limits on political contributions to candidates and electronically disclose campaign finance information. The intent of this law is to reduce the influence of large political contributors and to promote public confidence in our elected officials. The emphasis is mine. And that's why I believe that this topic is something that is not so much saying that this is a problem or that this is a solution looking for a problem. Rather, the intent of the government in the first place, the origins of this government intended for campaign finance to be a part of it. And so what we're doing today is exploring the opportunity to build off of something that was originally supposed to be a cornerstone of this new government. And I'm not sure how many people here have seen the movie Moana, the Disney movie Moana. It happens to be one of my daughter's favorites. But there's a scene in there where Maui is explaining to Moana the concept of wayfinding, which was the way that people way back when used to navigate the waters. And there's a quote in there where he says, "In order to figure out where you're going, you must first figure out where you have been." That's the concept of wayfinding. And so that's what we're going to do today, is to look back and say, all right, where have we been? And that way we can dictate where we are trying to go. So the presentation today is going to be a brief recap in history of the new county government back in 2010. Then we're going to explore present day and the purposes of why we're here. We're going to also explore two key questions that came up in the initial presentation when I submitted my ideas in the first place, some research that backs up some of the proposed language, and then we'll see if we can explore some of the objections or feedback that I've heard up to this point. So as I mentioned in the opening, when the charter was initially drafted, an independent campaign finance committee was put together. It was chaired by then County Prosecutor Bill Mason, with the intent of making campaign finance suggestions and making it a cornerstone of this new government. The committee itself was comprised of 9 people, and they openly met and solicited input and opinions from the general public. One of the things that's interesting about this committee, and you can see the names on the next slide, is that it was a compilation of both current public officials as well as advocates and at the time also former candidates as well for office. And what the committee did was they put together a list of recommendations that they had hoped that the new county government, once put together, would put into place. I like this quote from Don Scipione, who is a former candidate, and he said, "There are no politicians on the committee besides Bill." And he was talking about the aspect of this new committee was to try and say, hey, how can we build trust in this new government? And that's what this committee's mission was. There really wasn't much politics, or at least they hoped there wasn't. The committee members contended that the idea is to free elected officials from special interests. And the committee itself made several recommendations, and I'll go into detail on some of those recommendations. One of those recommendations was something called the Cuyahoga County Clean Election Act, which up to this point I was not really that familiar with. And here's some of the aspects of that act. Oh, I'm sorry, before I get to that. There was the Election Act, but then also some of the suggestions were registering lobbyists and require them to disclose meetings, limiting contributions to $1,000 for an individual per election to county executive, and $750 for county council, requiring donors to disclose their primary employer, and limiting contributions for all companies doing business with the county at $2,000 per election. And then, of course, banning contributions from county workers, which is something we saw eventually implemented in the new administration. I'm going to put pins in a couple of those points. One is on the actual limits, and the second is on contributions from companies doing business with the county. We're going to come back to those later. The Clean Election Act was one of the most, quote, ambitious portions of the committee's recommendations, and that quote is from the Plain Dealer. In this particular case, the executive candidates would raise seed money of up to $100,000 to start their campaigns. And then they use that money to collect other contributions, smaller ones, in order to qualify for public dollars. The county would then in turn provide public dollars in certain amounts, whether it was a contested primary or contested general election. The point of this was to try and ensure that a person could fundraise on their own, but then there would also be a level playing field in the with the public financing aspect of this. This particular idea didn't really gain traction in the new county government, but did at least provide a framework for what a public financing could look like if the county decided to go to that point in the future. As I said, the recommendations were from the committee never made into the final version, but this was the key part. The intent was always there. The committee members had hoped that the new government would set up campaign finance language and have them in place by 2012 when our commission met, or at the very least have them be considered in the inaugural Charter Review Commission. So what did that committee say? Well, here's some of the key quotes. And this was from Prosecutor Mason. He said, if we're really going to change the government does business, we have to deal with the political process of elections and those that influence them. And there also was a letter that came from Matt Dolan to Prosecutor Mason, in which then former Representative Dolan said that he pledged support for electronic filing, lobbying requirements, and contribution limits, but opposed public financing. Now, here's the part that kind of kick-started a lot of these community conversations was in the absence of limits, it opened the doors to large campaign contributions. In one case, you had a contribution of $280,000. Another, you had a contribution of $150,000. Eventually, there would be a total campaign of over $1 million, with most of those campaign contributions coming from a handful of individuals. There was a quote from one of the committee members, Subodh Chandra, who is a well-known civil rights attorney, and he said, if we don't fundamentally change the way we elect people, we're going to find ourselves back in the same boat. He likened it to the Wild Wild West. And he said that these reforms were needed to bring transparency and accountability to the government, which at the time was rocked by a corruption investigation. This was another really interesting quote from Catherine Terser, whose letter you have in front of you. It said, there is a cost to corruption. People are unduly influenced. Let's get to the root of corruption and break ties with public money. And the cost to corruption, I believe she could have also been talking about trust or the actual economic losses as a result of corruption. So in 2012, our Charter Review Commission got together, and one of the things we talked about was campaign finance limits. There were several suggestions made, including, and you'll see in the minority report of our final report, to tie those council limits to state house candidate limits. The state house districts in Cuyahoga County very closely mirror Cuyahoga County council districts as well. There wasn't enough support on the commission for that specific suggestion, in part because there was a lot of unknowns about best practices elsewhere. And there were other pressing issues that we were talking about, namely the clerk of courts, the inspector general, whether to have an appointed or elected county prosecutor. And there was a lot of time and a lot of energy spent on just those three topics alone, as well as a personnel review committee as well. So what we could all agree on was that county council should feel empowered to create language on the topic. We thought at the time that ambiguity would be an asset to the proposal and would strengthen the chances of it actually making through. But because of the lack of context and frankly the lack of specificity for debate, it proved to be a fatal liability.
Can I just stop you there for
Yes,
just
of course.
a quick second? So when you're talking about ambiguity, what was it about the proposal that was ambiguous?
So there was no specific language that was proposed at the time. One of the things that we had collectively agreed on was that it was a topic that needed research and needed some sort of context to an actual proposal. We got a lot of that context with things like the clerk of courts and exploring the relationship between the current clerk of courts and the judges, for example. So we understood how we got to this point and also to make better recommendations on how better move forward. We didn't have that with campaign finance. We basically said, let's have council set aside some time to talk about this, and then they can determine what they would feel more comfortable with. So as opposed to a specific recommendation, which we did for like the Inspector General, where we had this elaborate language on the Inspector General to enshrine in the charter, that council could say, well, I like this part, but I don't like this part. Or succession, I like this, but I don't like this. There was no opportunity for that debate or dialogue in the campaign finance proposal because there was no specific language submitted. It was simply, you guys should do something, we hope you do something, and there was nothing to happen.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So one of the things that I learned from that is that there was legitimate feedback and questions from members of council that I wanted to use as a learning opportunity to shape any future proposals. And many of the feedback that I learned from 2012, I hope to reflect in our current presentation today. Now here's present day. When you look at other levels of government, the federal level has campaign finance limits, and in this table, you'll see the actual limits that individuals have. Judicial races have limits that are set by the Ohio Supreme Court. The state has limits. Both the House and the Senate have limits. The city of Cleveland has limits as well, though those are in ordinance. So the Cleveland City Charter says there shall be limits, and there were limits that were enshrined in the city charter. Eventually, those were repealed and then put into ordinance so they could be changed. And last year they were. There were $1,000 limits for individuals for mayor, $1,000 for council. Last year they were increased to $5,000 for mayor and $1,500 for council. So at present, Cuyahoga County is the only level of government that does not have campaign finance language or limits. So the purpose of having any type of suggestion around campaign finance, whether it's limits or disclosures or frankly just electronic searching, is to bring it into alignment with other levels of government. It also promotes transparency and accessibility for public office, and we're still only 8 years old as a new government, so continuing to build trust in that new government is essential. So one of the questions specifically from Mayor Persiak that came up in my initial proposal is, can the county create limits? And the answer to that question is yes. The following language is from the Secretary of State website, where it says that county or local candidates are not limited in the amount of contributions they may receive unless there is a municipal or county charter that provides otherwise. So in this case, we are empowered as a county charter government to have limits if we want them. All right, now this picture is the thinker in front of the Cleveland Museum of Art. So I try my best to include some Cleveland aspects in this. So what would campaign finance look like? So in this case, we're going to zoom out a little bit into the national perspective. The following information is from the National Council on State Legislators, which is the authoritative figure on government information. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was the average of campaign finance limits for governor. As you can see, the national average is a little over $5,600. For state senate, it's about $2,500. State house also close to $2,400. Now, the highest limit for the governor is in New York at $50,000. but the highest limits for state Senate and state House in the country, the highest is in Ohio. Thought very interesting, $12,532. The lowest limits are $500 for Alaska, $170 for Montana, in both the state and the House.
That's interesting.
The following map is from the Association on Counties, and here's a really interesting map that displays the counties in yellow that are in elected county executive structure, as opposed to your commissioner models. As you can see in Ohio, there are only 2 counties that have elected county executives. There are several hundred that have county executives. What's difficult is to be able to sift through that data and to find counties that A, have an elected county executive, B, with a comparable population, and C, determine if they have campaign finance limits, and if so, how much. So it was a little bit of a challenge to find examples of counties in this particular case. However, there were cities that had similar populations to ours that we could look to as examples. So Cuyahoga County in the last census has approximately 1.2 million citizens. There are 2 examples that I'd like to bring to the Commission's attention. One is San Diego, and in your packet, you'll see a chart with the City of San Diego's campaign finance limits. This is a chart that that both explains the type of law in place. In this case, the individual limits are $550 for district candidates and $1,050 for citywide, but also includes the rationale for why those laws are in place. And one of those rationales is prevents corruption and the appearance of corruption. And when you look at some of the other explanations that are in here, one of the interesting parts is about the identification of major donors on campaign advertisements. And then there are also, and I'm having trouble finding it right off the top of my head, but there was language on if a person self-finances over $250,000 of their own money, then the campaign finance limits double for the rest of the candidates. So that prevents kind of the independent expenditure conversation from dominating discussions. But it was very, very interesting to see how San Diego approaches it. Now, by the way, they are a mayor and 8 city council members nominated by district but elected statewide. So geographically, it's very, very close to Cuyahoga County. Population-wise, Philadelphia is also very close in population. They have 1,526,000 people. Their individual limit is 3,000, and that applies to all city candidates: mayor, city council, district attorney, sheriff, and etc. Sorry, so that point about the if a candidate contributes $250,000 or more is from Philadelphia, not San Diego. But still, the campaign contribution limits for all candidates in that office double, which I also, as I said, thought was a very interesting kind of take on that. Also, contribution limits are adjusted every 4 years for inflation, and they just did their last adjustment back in 2016. All right, so let's talk about the actual proposed ideas that I'd like to submit to this commission. There are 2 buckets that I'd like to separate the ideas into. One is the actual campaign finance limits, and there are 2 steps associated with that. And then the second bucket is around campaign contributions for those doing business with the county. So let's explore bucket 1, and we'll call this part A. One of the things that we discovered in the 2012 commission was the need to empower council to be able to enact campaign finance language in the first place. And one of the things that we needed to insert was in section 3.09, the powers and duties of the council, to specifically include the word "and duties," so that anything that is proposed could actually be put into law. The second step after that would be done is the actual language of limits itself. Divide this into two phases. The initial language, the limits would be $7,500. And the way that I got to $7,500 was to find a balance between the initial limits that were proposed in the Campaign Finance Committee and the 12,000 state house limits, which is the highest in the country, to see if we can find sort of an equilibrium in allowing people to express via free speech, supporting their candidates, but also ensuring accessibility if possible by not having no limits at all. The second phase is after 4 years with that $7,500 in place, if it's working, fantastic. After that, council would be empowered, if they so chose, to change those limits to align with the state house limits. So if there are adjustments made at the state level, that would also affect the county one as well. So this is the actual language itself. I don't want to read all of this, but it would say council shall be enforced for a minimum of 4 years, and if not changed through ordinance thereafter. The actual language, this one comes from Philadelphia, where no individual shall make total contributions through one or more committees of more than $7,500 to a candidate for a county elective office. And then there was also
Calendar year now.
yes.
So are you saying that it's $7,500 per election cycle or $7,500 per year?
All right. So in the modified language, it says 7,500 for any single election. So I would clarify that I would prefer 7,500 for any election. So a primary would have limits, and then a general would also have limits, not to exceed 7,500 for any single election. Because there could be special elections down the line as well, and you would hope that they would be governed by the same type of campaign finance language.
Just one clarifying question on that as well. When you say single election, given we have primary and general, are we talking about the primary election and then the general election, or is it 75 combined? Because the reporting on that is.
I would prefer it to be 7,500 for that primary, and then another 7,500 for the general.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Well,
Because it could be a contested primary. I'm sorry. Yes, please.
what happens in off years? Someone's fundraising and you're technically not in an election cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Or does that,
That's what I asked.
right, that's why because if it's per year, then that takes care of that. If you're saying just the election, then the other 3 years, they could raise whatever they want.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great point. So you're saying that, and just to make sure I understand the question. So when you're talking about 7,500 per calendar year, that would include off years as well. And so if we said just per election, I guess, which would be during an election year, the question would then be what happens outside of election years. That sound about right?
So for 4 years,
Yes.
they can raise 30,000.
For 4 years. Yeah. So they would raise 30,000
Then
per
it's
individual.
You're saying calendar
That's what
year.
I've asked, because I just need to understand
No,
what
that's
you're trying
that's
to do.
a completely fair question, and that's something that we can talk about in terms of we talked about the intended consequences and the unintended consequences. So I would like to explore that and be like, okay, how would off election years be governed? And then I also think that there's conversations around special elections as well. And if we do get to that point, would you have campaign finance limits for those as well? So it's a good question, and I would love to work through that.
Right, because that would then be in conflict with what you just told Michael, because then Michael's, you're saying 15,000 a year. Is it okay?
Well, 7,500 for the primary and 7,500 for the general.
Right,
And that's 15. So that's 15,000 total.
15,000 for
right?
that year then. So
And
you
then-
can't really put a limit on a year and then say, but there you,
And then a limit.
I'm
on
just, and I'm just.
Sure. No, that's okay.
It's really a question. I'm not saying this is your
Good question.
presentation. I just wanted to add for the clarification.
It's either, the goal is either 2 election cycles or 2 years. Because if you're raising money in the first year, after you're elected to office, then if you've got a limit of 15,000, whatever you raise in that first year, the second year goes towards your total for the primary.
Gotcha. Okay. No, I'm following. Yeah.
And then you get another shot at it.
Gotcha.
So the recommendation I mean, we can have a discussion on both,
Sure.
but the recommendation is either annual limits or election cycle limits.
Sure. Okay.
See, and the thing I'm more concerned about is whatever we do here, this may be used as a template throughout the entire county for municipal races or who knows what. So we need to be very clear, because those of us who serve in elected office, they're going to say, well, you voted for this at the county level, but you don't want to do this at the municipal level. So and because this will come to be somewhere.
It's a sound question, and that's something I'd love to explore, with the commissioner. Yes, please.
Well, the other problem is you have a candidate. Let's say it's Friends of Susan Drucker. You don't know what I'm raising. That doesn't designate what office. So I could raise as much money as I want. I still have one campaign bank account, and I can use that for any race I want, unless you're going in judicial or federal. But so I that's another consequence we have to look at. And the only thing is I don't see municipalities. I don't think municipalities will get very personal and say the county's not going to dictate what we're doing with our own charter. That's why everybody's got their own charters. Now, it will raise people. Somebody will go to the city. And see, this is the problem you have now, Tom. I don't have this anymore, but I could see that becoming a debate, not just cities just saying, okay, the county did it, so we'll do it too. Because again, we're pointing out all these little issues that you have to address.
And one more thing we need to talk about. Everybody assumes this will be used strictly for re-election campaigns, but these funds that they actually raise go for several different things. They use them for contributions to XYZ homecoming, to XYZ veterans of foreign wars affairs, to all these other things, and they, according to state law, you can do a lot of this. So my only fear is I want this to be as descriptive as possible, and the judge can attest to this. There's always going to be 500 interpretations, and we just want to limit as many interpretations as we can if, in fact, we're going to do this.
I understand. And just to clarify, too, so the limits at the state are per calendar year. So I hope that perhaps might clarify, the actual limits per calendar year.
Yeah, but you have to tell us what you're supporting, because I'm familiar with the calendar year limitation, but the question is, how much can you raise
In
for
the
election? If you want to advocate for election cycle or for year. So
No, I understand. Yeah, my preference.
One last thing
Yeah,
to
sure.
clarify and pick up off you, Diane.
Yeah.
Calendar year needs to be defined.
Yeah. Okay. We can do that.
Everybody has a different calendar year.
And I'm very sensitive this right now, having just come off the city of Cleveland mayoral election where there were, people gave, but they gave to a limit and they couldn't exceed that within the 12 months of January through December. So.
Okay.
So
I appreciate that. Yes.
Obviously, when you were sitting down to think about this when you were sitting down to think about this in the first instance, obviously you recognized that there were going to be a lot of questions. The one that comes to mind for me is, how do you deal with and address the issue, I think, that's kind of been inherent in some of the comments that have been made as it relates to dark money. Money that's not given specifically to a candidate, but benefits that candidate. And because the problem with campaign contributions across the boards, as far as I'm concerned, is that when you put limits in place, there are people who do all kinds of creative ways to get around, the limitations that you place. So I'm wondering, as we're going through this, and maybe it's addressed in some of what's left, what thought you gave to dealing with the issue of dark money.
So, how much time do we have? So one of the things that I think we need to recognize is that this is a fluid situation. And if nothing else, the past few years with the Supreme Court decisions have shown us that there has been a lot of changes made in the way that people influence elections. So I want to receive that and be open to that perspective. There are some things that we can control, and there's some things that we cannot control. And in this particular case, we can control if there is any type of language built into the charter and how we as a new county government approach this topic. And there are things that I can't control, namely the Supreme Court, who have made 2 decisions at least in the past few years that have shaped this topic. So what I don't want to do is to go beyond the scope of what we can do in this charter government, and then hopefully advocate for changes outside of that as well, because it's a concern of mine as well, frankly.
Bill, but really the judge is spot on with this stuff. I mean, all you have to do is turn the TV on right now and just watch what's going on in these gubernatorial campaigns. Now, I'm not going to ask the judge for an interpretation of dark money, but I would believe that's dark money. And no political candidate is taking credit for all of this mudslinging that's already going on, but it's some group that is taking credit for it. And I think that would be a good way to define dark money. Well, believe me, that goes on even in municipal governments. So I don't know how you really attack that and get that right.
I mean, public financing is probably like one of the methods by which people have approached trying to eliminate dark money. And in fact, that's referenced in one of the letters that was submitted, is how Seattle does a voucher system, which is one of the first in the country. But I also recognize that public financing is a very controversial topic and an uphill battle to go from nothing to all the way public financing. So is there a way to at least take a step forward in putting campaign finance language into the charter? What that language is and how we define it is open for the deliberation, frankly.
Well,
I'm not a practicing lawyer. However, we want to make sure if we're going to put language there, and if this committee decides to so recommend it and the county council decides to put it out there, it's not going to be challenged at the Supreme Court level, at the Ohio Supreme Court level.
Or the U.S. Supreme Court
Yeah,
level.
I mean, I just don't know, but I don't want to go through a bunch of things, a bunch of recommendations, and then find out that some court is going to set it aside after we go through it. So,
Well, I mean, respectfully, Mayor, there are language limits in other aspects of government that are completely illegal and have been upheld. So that's one of the things that I would like to say is, can we bring the county into alignment with the other levels of government that do have campaign finance limit language in place? Right now we have none, and that's the biggest problem. Yeah. So that's the biggest concern I have, is the absence of that language leaves that door open to big donors in the first place.
Can you clarify for me the concept of a voucher system? What does that do?
Sure. I have not done nearly as much research into that as others have done.
Right. I'm totally devoid of any knowledge.
Sure.
So
I would actually defer to Ms. Terser, who was a member of that committee. The voucher system in Seattle, is the best I understand it, they have a certain pot of money that they set aside for elections, and then people can request vouchers for a certain amount of money that they can then use their voucher to support any particular candidate that they feel strongly in. So it gives
I mean,
the
citizens.
correct citizens can request a voucher and then give that voucher to a candidate. So on one hand, it's public dollars and an equal accessibility, but also allowing the citizen to make a choice. I don't know, again, I don't know the intricacies of that program. It's one of the first in the country. There has been some preliminary research that suggests that the program has been successful, but I admit to not knowing nearly enough amount of detail to go into it at this point.
Well,
That substitutes from a public match? That's the
Correct.
substitution?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. The initial committee recommended kind of that public match, if you will. This one is simply straight voucher.
well, so campaign limits everywhere except Cuyahoga County, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have examples of where it's functioning. Now, people may disagree with the limits. So can we, is there an example that we can just maybe look at those limits and adjust for this county and submit that as a recommendation?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that. That's the next slide. So looking at the objections, we can look at a couple of the examples of individuals who have either loaned themselves or given themselves money. In this particular case, I had referenced the $1 million earlier, but also there was an example in the mayoral election where a candidate gave his campaign $1 million in this particular case. So one of the things that we hear a lot of criticism about is, what if you have a candidate that has a lot of money? Would you limit people who don't have the means, and then they would have to fundraise more or get more donors in order to try and compete with the donor? And in these particular cases, at least in recent history, they did raise, in some cases, 2 to 1, even 3 to 1, but ultimately didn't necessarily translate into affecting the outcome, or they weren't victorious in the actual outcome. When you look at the instances of a person having means and fundraising themselves, and then you would limit accessibility for people to be able to try and raise money to compete, I would argue that the exact opposite is true as well, that not having limits opens the door to people to give whatever they want, and then you can, with 1 or 2 donations, completely clear the field, or at least make it more difficult for people who don't have access to those same high value donors, high amount of money donors. So I would say that the phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, it doesn't necessarily have to show itself broken right off the bat for there to still be an issue in accessibility. And that's where I would argue having something in place is better than having nothing. Now, this is the second idea that I was going to propose, and this explores one of the root issues that came up during the investigations, was the relationship between the county government and contractors. And at the federal level, there is a uh-oh.
That's all right, we'll look up here.
Okay. My apologies. I maybe didn't print out the most recent PowerPoint. So in this particular case, it is at the federal level, there is a ban on individuals who are government contractors from giving money to a federal candidate for public office. This is actually very similar to the proposal made by the the Campaign Finance Committee that I referenced earlier, where they propose reducing contributions to $2,000. At the federal level, it's banned completely. And this was recently upheld in court, in federal court. And coincidentally, they cited the Demora case in that opinion on why this was in place. So one of the interesting parts is, can we use this as a baseline? And in this particular case, the language would just change from United States to Cuyahoga County, but would eliminate individuals who are county contractors from giving to county elected officials and candidates. So I close with the word opportunity, because I do believe that it is a relatively new government. There's still things being worked out, ideas being proposed, but I would also argue that we're still building trust in the taxpayers and in the public officials. And having the presence of campaign finance language, whether it's the limits that we talked about or the ban on county contractors giving money to elected officials, I believe that either one of those two or both would provide an opportunity to continually build that trust in the new government, and frankly, to continue something that was started when the new charter government was put together in the first place. So with that, I thank you.
Well, I didn't see, or maybe I wasn't listening closely enough, but I didn't see or hear a lot of emphasis on some things that I read in here earlier about emphasis on transparency, enhancing transparency by making it possible or making it fairly impossible for you to give significant amounts of money without either you or the committee that you've donated to letting folks know that that's what you did. Can you speak on that aspect of things?
Sure. So one of the things that I did when I was exploring how would having a limit of $7,500 influence current elections, so people who are running for office, and in fact, there were 95% of the contributions that were given in these local elections at the county level were below that 7,500 threshold. So there were only a handful of individuals who gave more than $7,500.
Now, are you talking about 95% of the people who gave?
Yes.
Gave
less than $7,500.
What was the dollar amount that the people who gave more than that? What percentage of the total was that?
There, I think there was 5 in the most recent campaign finance limits. There was 5 that were over 7,500. So, by the way, I printed out all of the campaign finance reports that I could find on the website, and to try and go through them line by line and to see how many fell beneath that 7,500. There's no way right now to electronically sort by dollar value amount. It's easier for me to sort the value of a car on Auto Trader than it is for me to be able to sort campaign contributions. And I think that that's something that if we're talking about transparency and accessibility, that I would love to see changed. So in those that I was able to go through line by line by line by line, I was only able to see a handful in the most recent county executive and even in some of the past county council and county executive races. I could probably count the number on 2 hands, and that's about it.
Does Summit County have limits?
Summit County does not have limits right now. They also have more elected offices as well that would be affected by something like this. I think they have an elected sheriff, and I think they have an elected fiscal officer as well. So yeah, they have quite a few that would fall under this as well. In this case, we just have 2 of the countywide ones.
Okay. Any more questions, Mike?
Mr. Chair, I know, just to clarify on which offices this would apply to, I'm assuming it would apply to the council, the executive, and the prosecutors, the 3 charter elected
Yes.
offices? Okay.
Yes, that's right.
Just wanted to get that on the record.
Sure.
Also, I'm somewhat intrigued about your proposal to prohibit contributions by contractors in particular. It seems to address an acute concern beyond simply, setting limits on contributions more generally. It also avoids a lot of the devil in the details that, we've been talking about here today. I think my concern on the limits is that if we attempt to create a level playing field by putting limits in place, you can, because of the Supreme Court rulings that have come out, create an unlevel playing field inadvertently, and I know you mentioned the rich candidate theory. I think that's a concern, but also dark money, and I think local elections without high dollar amounts are particularly susceptible to outside influence in some instances. But I generally agree with the concept of campaign finance. I think it's a good impulse. So those are just some of my thoughts. I don't have a particular question for you on that, but
No, I appreciate it.
I'm just curious, if others have similar thoughts.
Sure, and I'm open to approaches on both issues. Right, they're two very different issues. One is the actual financial fiscal support, and the other is a conversation about the influence of contractors. And so I'm open if there is agreement on the commission and saying, okay, maybe this one warrants additional details or exploration, but this one we're more comfortable with. I'm open to that conversation as well. This is literally me putting the thoughts out there into the marketplace of ideas and to get feedback.
Well, another consideration that is running around in my mind, it has to do with presentation of some of these ideas. I think it's one thing maybe to present this all as a package. I mean, I think that's one way to go. But there might be other things where some things are more likely to meet with approval than other, and it would be a situation where it would be better to get something, than to go away with nothing because it was all packaged together. Did you have any thoughts, as you were constructing this, about the efficacy of going one direction or the other?
Well, so Mr. Chair, just when I look at the experience that I had, thank you, Council. So when I look at the experience that I had in the last commission, the lack of specificity was the issue. In this particular case, it was saying, okay, if we wanted to have some sort of specific limits or specific language, what would that look like? Are there best practices that we can look at elsewhere that have been upheld in court or have been utilized effectively to build trust in government? San Diego and Philadelphia are but just 2 examples of places that have it. So I would probably caution against saying, well, I'm more comfortable with this, but I'm not 100% on board with this as presented. And if there are shortcomings or concerns, we can work through that, as opposed to just saying, yes on this and no on this. I would respectfully ask and say, okay, if this is a yes, fantastic. If this is a not yet, what are some of the concerns? Maybe it's the calendar year discussion versus the election year. I'm open to 2 buckets, 2 different ideas, but also getting feedback and suggestions on how to strengthen both.
Well, I'm not going to prolong this, but I guess what I'm saying is I think that there may be some things that if they are connected to some other things, will do in the whole package. Regardless of how you tweak it, that when it gets to council, the recommendation that comes from us is likely not to be adopted. Whereas there may be a process by which you could decouple some things that would allow at least some of them an opportunity to get through, even if some other things didn't get through. And recognizing how some of this all hangs together, and probably makes sense as a package, and maybe it might not make as much sense, you know, if it was decoupled. I'm still kind of curious about process-wise, you know, how we get this to council in a way that will end up with something positive coming out of it. So that's why that was the genesis of the question.
So like, let's say, for example, just make sure maybe I understand. If there was, say, a campaign finance section, just hypothetically, campaign finance section, and there's 2 suggestions from this commission, and there would be 2 votes taken, one on this and one on this. And if either one of them make it, fantastic, amen, and it moves forward. I'm open to separating them into 2 buckets. It's the same topic, and therefore, because we're frankly meeting 1 meeting per topic, is why I had to couch them together. I'm open to 2 votes on those things that just happen to be tied together in the same section.
I think we'd have to have a lot of intentionality to recognize, you know, because in some respects, if you divided some of these things apart, it probably wouldn't make sense, okay, if one was passed and the other one was not passed. I mean, that is something I think that we'd have to take into consideration, but in other respects, it might be that something, you know, that the proposals might be severable, so that you could pass one and not pass the other, and we'll go forward.
As long as something gets done. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But something.
Yeah.
You know, that's the big part.
I guess the other side that I'm struggling with is, given the nature of what the ultimate goal is, I don't want to make it so that it would be easy for council to dismiss the area of campaign finance because of the fact that, or important parts of the issue of campaign finance because of the fact we had decoupled it. So I think that as we're looking at this, you know, we really are going to have to be intentional about how we either put things together or how we divide them apart.
Sure.
If that makes any sense.
I appreciate that.
Okay. Any more questions for Will?
That's a long presentation.
Was somebody else part of your presentation today?
There are individuals who would suit to testify on this issue.
Okay. And
Not necessarily a part of it.
during public input?
Yes.
Okay, we'll do that then. Any other discussion from members of the commission? Okay, thanks, Mr. Charlie. Okay. I think we're down to public input then. Janae?
Excuse me, before we go to public input, so what are our next steps with this issue? Where are we, is Will gonna go back and maybe rewrite this or take in our questions and suggestions, or what is the next step for this particular topic?
I was really thinking that we would do something similar with this to what we did with regard to succession. That is, to give an opportunity to fine-tune based upon the discussion that's been had today, and give us an opportunity to see the redraft, and then come back again and see where we are. What's kind of clear as we're working through this is that each one of these things that we've decided on are going to require multiples. And also, this will give us an opportunity, once there is a redraft, well, first of all, for us to clarify some of our own personal thinking, but also to give us an opportunity to have staff and the law department kind of weigh in on thoughts that they might have. And I think that would be useful for us. And I don't know if everybody's in agreement with that.
Judge, I concur 100%. And I think until we get some of this back, I mean, I understand the need for public input, but I don't know what input they could present at this time that would help me, in my mind, make a better decision until all the things you pretty much listed would be clarified, because as of right now, I have a lot of questions too, so I don't, you're the chairman, that's your call.
We're at 5:03. We do have people who are here.
Well, I still think we need,
For public
I think we
input.
need, still have public
Yes.
comment, because that may help Will too, give Will some direction.
That would be useful. So,
For public comment, we have Councilman Dale Miller.
Good afternoon, Judge and members of the commission. I would start by saying that I'm not part of this presentation, but I do support campaign finance limits, and I'm going to offer a couple of suggestions. One is that I do favor the approach of the limit being per election. And the way of thinking of the cycles is that the primary cycle runs from the day after the general election until the next primary. And the general election cycle runs from the day after the primary till the day of the general election. And to do it that way, if you don't do it that way, it encourages fundraising every year, and it works against candidates who don't get started years in advance. So I think it's just a better way to do it. The second thing is about the $7,500 limit. I think it's way too high. Keep in mind these limits are per individual. And often husband and wife will both contribute. And so that means you're talking that for one election there can be a donation of $15,000 in the primary and $15,000 for the general election, for a total of $30,000. That's an awfully big donation by my way of thinking. I know you're going to ask me, well, what number would you suggest? And I would be thinking along the lines of 1,000 for county council and 2,500 for the executive, which means that again, if you do husband and wife and primary in general, it could be 4,000 per election for the council and 10,000 per election for the executive, which are pretty big donations. I could live with up to twice that much, 2,000 and 5,000. So, and those ranges would be within the ranges of what we heard for the city of Cleveland and what we heard for San Diego and what we heard for the average for state legislators across the country. I think it fits with some benchmarks that are out there, and I don't think we should authorize the council to go to the state limit, which is the highest in the country. I think authorizing the council to modify it from time to time based on inflation would be more appropriate. So that's the finance limit. Regarding the prohibition of on contributions from contractors, I'm okay in principle, but I want to raise a couple of devil in the details things for you to think about. One is that we already prohibit corporate contributions. So I presume we're talking about prohibiting contributions from individuals that are associated with contracting companies. So the question is, is only the contribution from the CEO prohibited, or is it anybody who works for the company or executive staff? So we need to think about that. And the other thing is that I, as a prospective candidate, I can't possibly know who all the county contracts with. It's thousands, you know. So I wouldn't want to be in a situation where I could get myself in legal trouble for unknowingly accepting a contribution from. So there's that to think about. So those are my thoughts. I think you should do something, and I'll close by saying that whatever you send us, it's not all or nothing. You know. We can decouple it if we need to, and you know, if there's parts of it that just won't pass, but other parts that will, we can take the part that works and put it on the ballot. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about that. I would just find the very best suggestions that you got and send them over to us. Thank you.
Now we have public comment from Lou.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I just learned a good lesson here, and also combined with the lesson I learned in the meeting earlier today and also yesterday. Now, charter is about the government, and actually the government is formed by people. So any election we want to include more people, the more the better. We should have easy and equal access as possible. So in this case, first of all, let's just say in this whole room, I'm the least qualified person to run for anything, right? But now if I snapped, I decided to run for either of this position. But of course, I started late, right, with my short legs. So if we use calendar years, other people, they are already working in this field. If we use calendar year, they already got the fundraising or all the things going on for 4 years. Since I snapped now, I only have 1 or 2 years. Would that be fair? So maybe calendar year may not be the best idea. The other thing is for the voters. I would say in this case, the voucher system would be good because we know in this whole county, the majorities are not rich people. With this voucher, people don't have big money saved to contribute to their ideal candidates will be able to have that same access to contribute because they have the voucher. They can give the voucher to the most idealist candidate in their mind. So this may be help because we should encourage people to participate. Doesn't matter if they run for office or they come out to vote. And in this case, that will correct the problem that only rich people has access, the rest of the people becomes very passive about it. And now they have to wait till some disaster happening to them, then they come to the government to claim or to complain. This is what has happened since last week. We have a child died due to some government entities handling situations. Of course, for homeless people populations, there has no voice really for homeless people to begin with. So do you think these people will come out to vote? No. They already have been suppressed. They become silent. They hate the government. They think they never get help. So if we do all these things to make sure all the people will have easy access to participate in something, this actually will help to build the trust. So I wish this would happen. In my little opinions, 0.2 cent, I think we can separate this into two, separate the individual and the business or contractor. This is a good idea, actually. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Sunny Simon.
Good evening. Thanks for listening to this issue. I just wanted to inform the commission that this issue did present itself at the last charter review, and council was not favorable to the idea, nor the majority, as I understand, would not be favorable, and there's a good reason why. I agree that the impulse is good to have campaign finance reform. However, the reality is, when we look back from 2010, when the Citizens United decision was issued by the United States Supreme Court, which declared that contributions, it's a First Amendment right. And what has ensued since 2010 is we have seen an uprise in dark money. What I mean by that are PACs. PACs that allow for contributions to come in unlimited amounts of money by anonymous donors. So that's what has happened since the beginning of our new government when we look back. You know, we had a visual of when we look back, well, what's happened to Citizens United? What's also happened is we saw this in actual time, that the first executive race in this county was by and among 2 millionaire families and one ordinary person, Ed Fitzgerald. So I'm glad we brought up Matt Dolan, who's a great guy. But he funded his campaign with his own money and his family money in excess of $1 million. That's a self-funded millionaire. We also had Ken Lancy, who came in with $1 million or over $1 million, which already created an uneven playing field. And we had an ordinary non-millionaire, Ed Fitzgerald, who did not even come close to having this kind of family connection or money, who put him automatically at a disadvantage. And so what he had to do is he had to go out and raise money, so at least we had a competitive race. So the idea of campaign finance reform is great in theory, but in actuality in today's world, because of the United States Supreme Court, we cannot control and stop millionaires from funding themselves, which is, I think, diametrically opposed to what we try to accomplish as a level playing field. It doesn't. It creates an uneven playing field and an unfair game. And because of the Supreme Court behind this, there's no way to go around this. I heard Mr. Tarter say we can go around it, we can do this. No, we can't. That's the United States Supreme Court. We can't stop PACs or dark money. And what's going to happen when we talk about transparency and trying to build trust? The opposite will occur. It becomes less transparent, more contributions to PACs. We don't have the, you know, as hard as it is to read our you know, election donation, those are public. Those are there for you to look at online. But when you start contributing to these PACs, there's no transparency whatsoever. So there's a reason why council was not in favor of this, because of these two things, the history in Cuyahoga County as well as the Supreme Court. And so I am opposed to it for these reasons. And by the way, we're different from the state. We don't see lobbyists here. The only time I've seen lobbyists, maybe 3 times in my committee, one for consumer protection, bag fees from the plastic industry, and maybe once more. But we are not getting lobbyists coming in here like the states do. That's their way of life at the state and the municipal levels. I'm sure you're not getting visited by pharmaceutical, plastic industries, coal, agriculture. We don't see that here. We just don't. So what this does, it creates a problem, A, that doesn't exist, and it makes it worse. It makes dark money, big money that we'll never be able to see, and it pits the little guy against the big guys. And just because it turned out a certain way, that $1 million, those $1 million did not translate into a victory, doesn't mean that that's the right way to go. That doesn't mean that's the right way to go, because one day we're going to see an imbalance that we can't correct. So I am passionate about this issue because I know, I'm a lawyer and I've been on this county government and I've seen what the problems are, but I see what's going to happen. if we unleash this, and there's no reason to do it. And it's to build trust is not to create more dark money. It's to make us more transparent. And the way to do that is to continue to have us mark down who's donating to us and contributing to us, and be able to look at that and make your assessment when going to vote. So those are my comments. Thank you so much. And I hope you're enjoying this. It's a fun experience.
Thank you.
We have Linda for public comment.
Hi, I'm Linda Mayer, and I'm speaking for the League of Women Voters on this. And as Will Tarter already said, we are in principle supporting his proposal in principle. And but a couple of things cross my mind as I'm listening to the testimony. And the first thing is, it seems to me that we're talking an awful lot about the deeply, deeply into the weeds of what this proposal would look like in its details. And I would like to suggest that the charter should never, excuse my voice today, the charter should never attempt to write the ordinance itself. The charter, it's too hard to tweak or to adjust or revise a charter proposal. And it's easier, and it's more public actually, to revise it if it's in an ordinance form. So, so basically, I think charter language ought to be short and general, and it should create a charge or the parameters of the characteristics that the council should address when it passes the ordinance. So that's one thought I have. Another thought was finally mentioned by one of your panelists. All of the talk on this subject hasn't included the elected office of prosecutor. So that should be included. I don't see why it would be excluded, but it's not mentioned in any of the materials. Another thing is, this proposal really does need to address the possibility of the millionaire candidate, the self-funding candidate. And it sounded to me as if the Philadelphia plan does do exactly that. It says if there's this huge amount of private money, of self-funded money from this candidate, then the limit on the opponents rises commensurately. Sounds to me that would be a simple thing to write into an ordinance or to mandate in a charter. So there's another thing on page 30 of Will Tarter's presentation where it says donations by a candidate or by a controlled committee. I thought that word controlled was odd. And it seems to me that that is a bit like the federal situation where the candidate isn't allowed to coordinate with the PAC that's put out this particular TV commercial. And if it's not coordinated with the candidate, then it doesn't count. And so that would have to be specified, I think, that not just a candidate's own controlled campaign committee, but other independent committees that come in from the outside and fund elections without being controlled, or at least the candidate says that he didn't control them. Do you catch what I'm saying there? The candidate's own controlled committee could be reined in by such legislation, but an uncontrolled committee could do whatever it wanted, and that's another loophole. So I think those were the main things I want. Oh, disclosure. Disclosure is the one angle of the broad spectrum of campaign finance thinking that has been explicitly permitted by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said disclosure is, the way to go. That is constitutional. So when framing this very broad, general, short addition to the charter, that I hope that you will make something short out of this long, complex thing, the council is better suited, and they're more likely to approve it and put it on the ballot if they have had a really good shot at framing it themselves, or if it enables them to follow a blueprint that's in the charter, but not to tell them exactly what to do. So I think a short, principled statement in the charter that tells the council to do this, and then let the council, there's maybe a way around Councilwoman Simon's objections, and the council will find it. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you.
And I don't speak for the whole League of Women Voters, but I am our county government chair, and so I poke around in these things. So thank you for those, if any of those help.
We have public comment from County Executive Armin Budish.
Hey, everybody. Howdy.
Okay, so I certainly appreciate, again, all your time and your efforts, and I appreciate Mr. Tartar's clearly detailed analysis. And just so you know where I come from, I mean, this is very well intentioned, and in theory, it would be great to have campaign finance reform. I have supported campaign finance reform for decades, actually. When I was in law school, I worked at Common Cause and participated in Common Cause's brief in the Buckley-Vallejo case, which lost. And that was the first of the Supreme Court cases that basically, in my view, made campaign finance limits unworkable and irrelevant. So let me come at this from two ways. First, and the question was, how do you get, what is the way to campaign finance reform? And the answer is one answer and one answer alone, and that is change the Supreme Court or change the Constitution. I guess it's two, but it's one. And in my view, neither of those are something that the county council can do. So, so I'll come at it two different ways. First is, if campaign finance limits truly would work, first it would give an edge, a significant edge to wealthy candidates. You can talk about somebody coming in and raising, $5 and $10 contributions. It worked for Barack Obama. It doesn't work at a local level, in my experience. And so, somebody coming in, we've heard examples already of people who comes in and could contribute $1 million or $2 million of their own money. It's going to have a huge advantage in any race when there are limits. And the second advantage it gives, which I haven't heard but I think is clear, is that it gives somebody with a, quote, good ballot name a huge advantage in this county. So having campaign contribution limits actually, I think, works against a good democracy in this example. If it worked, if campaign limits actually worked, but they don't because of the Supreme Court. So you cannot limit wealthy people to contribute. It's just you could pass all the laws you want. The Supreme Court has made it clear somebody with $10 billion can contribute whatever they want to their race. And second is you can't stop people from putting money into these super PACs or independent expenditures. You can't stop it. I don't care what we want to do. We could pass all the laws we want here. The Supreme Court has made it clear. That's why in the federal elections you have well, I don't know what it is now, $2,700 limit, and yet in Sherrod Brown and Jim Renacci, whoever is going to win that race, they're going to have $50 million in each of those races. It's not coming from the people who are contributing under the limits. It's coming from the PACs, and it's not just that it doesn't work; it makes it worse because you're forcing money into the dark money. And so what's going to happen is, I mean, right now you can look at the people who give the $2,700. That's all clear, and that's helpful to know who's contributing. And that's what you get in the county government right now. If you force the money into these PACs, you will not know who's contributing, and you have worse government, you have worse democracy, and I think it's directly counter to what we are all hoping would happen, but it doesn't happen. And I would cite a number of examples. I mean, I was in Columbus at a time when the Koch brothers decided for some reason they didn't like a zoo levy, a local zoo levy, and they managed to put, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars when nobody knows because it was dark money. And so there was no reporting of that, but they defeated the levy, and there was nothing that could be done. And they had limits, by the way. And even in our most recent mayoral race, I mean, I've heard cited, the city of Cleveland has limits. It's my understanding that there was a PAC set up to support Mayor Jackson's race, and there may have been one to support one or more of the other candidates. It's happening at local levels now, and we're going to, if this commission decides to recommend campaign limits, I think you're just going to push more money into the dark money. That's my comment. I don't think I've missed anything. And even with the limits now, I mean, I was the minority leader and speaker of the Ohio House, and I see what happens. They have $12,000 limits now. I think your number's a little off, by the way, Will. I think it's up a couple $100 over your numbers. But the point is that, you look at what the House Democrats or Republicans are spending, and you look at what the Senate Democrats or Republicans, they have $10 million, $8 million, $12 million. Again, there's, the limits, given the Supreme Court rulings, are virtually irrelevant. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. But
Hearing none? That's it? Okay. Very good. We need to select a date for our, we have a date for the next scheduled meeting, right?
May 2nd.
We need two more special meeting dates. We'll send out a doodle for both of those.
Yeah.
So we have some
best
time to
way.
sit down and deal with both of this. Okay. We can go from there. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Make the motion. Second.
And seconded? Any readiness on the motion? Hearing none, I guess we'll just
Aye.
adjourn.
BZA tonight at 7:30.
Thank you.